should I teach you how to say hello in
Yeah,
South Africa?
yeah.
Go up to anyone, you say Futsek.
Oh my, say it slower. Futsek.
Yeah.
Ah, Futsek.
Yeah. Can you say it? Bro, can I teach you a South African word?
Yeah, absolutely.
So like when you like greet someone in South Africa, you say Futsek.
Futsek.
Futsek, yeah.
Futsek, South Africa, bro.
Futsek, Tsotsies.
Yeah.
How do you say goodbye?
Ubua Masipa.
Ubua Masepa.
Yeah. So they
Ubua
yeah,
Masepa.
yeah. We got it, we got it.
South African words that shock Americans.
Americans call this a trunk. South Africans call it a boot. Americans would say, I'll pick you up. South Africans say, I'll fetch you. Americans call this a hood. South Africans call it a bonnet. Americans call this a traffic light. South Africans call it a robot. Americans call this aluminum. South Africans call it aluminium. Sounds so complex. Americans would say, I'm going to the liquor store. South Africans would say, I'm going to the bottle store. Americans would say a pickup truck. South Africans would say a bakkie. Americans would say, hi, how are you? South Africans would say, how's it? Americans would call this a barbecue. South Africans would call it a braai. Americans say, I'll be there soon. South Africans say, I'll be there now. Americans say gas station. South Africans say garage or petrol station. Americans call this a pacifier. South Africans call it a dummy. Americans say beef jerky. South Africans say biltong. Americans call this toothpaste. South Africans call it Colgate. Americans call this butter. South Africans call it rama. Americans say baloney. South Africans say polony. Americans call this medicine. South Africans call it muti. Americans say sidewalk. South Africans say pavement. Americans say ketchup. South Africans say tomato sauce. Americans say bar or pub. South Africans say tavern. Americans call this scotch tape. South Africans call it sellotape. Americans call these markers. South Africans call them gokkies. Americans call this soda or pop. South Africans call it cool drink. Americans call this grits or cornmeal. South Africans call it pap. Americans call this an elevator. South Africans call it a lift. Americans call this a mosquito. South Africans call it a mozzie. Americans call this an eraser. South Africans call it a rubber. Americans call these french fries. South Africans call them slop chips.
Oh my god! Bro!
Americans call this a sweater. South Africans call it a jersey. Americans call these cookies. South Africans call them biscuits. Americans call this candy. South Africans call it sweets. We call this a flashlight. South Africans call it a torch. Americans call this a faucet. South Africans call it a tap. Americans call this a popsicle. South Africans say ice lolly or sucka. Americans call this a shopping cart. South Africans call it a trolley. Americans say sweatpants. South Africans say track pants. Americans say chocolate bar. South Africans say chocolate slab. Americans say pants. South Africans say trousers. Americans say vacation. South Africans say holiday. Americans say sunglasses. South Africans say shades. Americans say turtleneck. South Africans say polo neck.
Fuck, that hurt, dude.
Yo. The top 3 slang words you need to know when you're in South Africa, part 3. Number 1, MXM, which sounds like, I know mine kind of sound Nigerian, but it basically means whatever, like F off, kind of like Futsek. Or when you roll in your eyes like, Wena, please, Wena, please. Number 2 is Chomi. I always hear Musa Kawula say it. He's like, show me. Or when somebody want to be nice to you and they want something. Let me borrow 200 rand, show me. Number 3 is just now or now, which is English, but people in South Africa speak English as a second language. It means they're on South African time. Like, I'm coming right now, but not really right now. Like in the States, we say colored people time. Shall I do part 4?
American versus South African phrases.
Hi, good morning. Mornings. Hi, how are you? How's it? Oh, my stomach kinda hurts after that. Yo, I feel nada. Oof, it's hot out here today. Yo, it's gak hot today. That food was amazing. Yo, that food was lekker. Yo, that would be fire. Yo, that would dala. Yo, that's a sweet car. Yo, that's a sick car.
South Africans, God will get you for the way that you're bullying me online. Especially the fact that you're doing it in your own language. I don't know what you're saying. I know it's bad because I saw one of the comments said something like, da 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 da. She dances like a washing machine. Why are you getting creative with these roasts? That's so rude.